This is going to be a close reading of A Noiseless Patient Spider by Walt Whitman. So, if I were modeling this process for my classes or for my students, we would always start with reading the poem out loud. So, we'll start there. So, A Noiseless Patient Spider by Walt Whitman. A noiseless patient spider. I marked where on a little promontory it stood isolated, marked how to explore the vacant, vast surrounding. It launched forth filament, filament, filament out of itself, ever unreeling them, ever tirelessly speeding them. And you, O my soul, where you stand, surrounded, detached in measureless oceans of space, ceaselessly musing, venturing, throwing, seeking the spheres to connect them. To the bridge you'll need be formed, to the ductile anchor hold, to the gossamer thread you fling catch somewhere, O my soul. So, a strategy that I use for close reading pretty often is the SIFT strategy. So it stands for symbolism, imagery, figurative language, theme, and tone. I often find that students struggle with symbolism. So sometimes I'll come to imagery or figurative language first and then come back to symbolism after we're a bit more familiar with the poem. So for this, we'll start and sort of look at imagery and then we'll look at figurative language and come back to symbolism. So if we're thinking in terms of imagery, things that we can see, feel, all of those, a noiseless patient spider is a great place to start. So I would identify it and then I would have students label it. And we would discuss sort of what they see in their head when they think of a noiseless patient spider. Obviously, we can talk about that as an example of personification as well. But really, what do they see when they think of a noiseless patient spider? Same here as we come down to the bottom lines of the first stanza where it talks about it launched forth filament, ever unreeling them, ever tirelessly speeding them. We're going to grab that as an example of imagery and then talk about how that language sort of communicates something that's happening, a very like kinetic, energy focused idea. And what that means. So, like the actual creation of the spider's web, right? And how he or it or she is creating this web. Another example, as we sort of moved down into the second stanza, and we're looking at examples of like potential imagery here, we sort of get this description of this detached in measureless oceans of space. So we could identify this as a piece of imagery as well and really discuss what it is that Whitman is saying with this metaphor. What does he mean when we say oceans of space? What does that really sort of call to mind? And we could discuss like the reiteration from the first stanza of this vacant, vast surrounding, and that this sort of reiterates that idea, this vast sort of emptiness when we think of space. So continuing with figurative language, now that we've grabbed this metaphor here, we can take a look at this situation where we're personifying the soul in the same way that we're personifying the spider here at the top, as those two things go together. The spider serves as a symbol for the soul later in the poem. So we know that this is a symbol, which gives us our S piece. But if we come back to this personification, we're giving the soul this idea that our soul is by itself, sort of standing in this vacant, vast, empty ocean of space. And it feels a very specific way. So we could look at this personification, and then we can sort of look at some of the other things that the author does, not just figuratively, but in terms of just authorial choices and like poetic devices. So we see the repetition of the word filament here and discuss why. Why would we repeat this word? What is it that Whitman is trying to convey to us with filament? Is it like the amount of effort that the spider is giving? Is it how much of this connection that's being launched forth that's really emphasized by the repetition of that word? We could also talk about the vacant, vast surrounding, the use of this sound device, this alliteration. Again, re-emphasizing the vast sort of emptiness, this chasm that sort of seems to stand between our spider and this thing that he's attempting to connect with that's on the other side of it. We see that sort of re-emphasized here where it talks about on a little promontory it stood isolated. So again, we have another piece of imagery happening here where it sort of really seems like our spider is isolated from everything else. Again, sort of reconnecting all of the ideas that we've seen in the poem so far. So coming back into that second stanza, we have this example of personification. And then we have this metaphor that we've talked about, sort of re-emphasizing the vastness of the space. And then as we're coming down into the third and fourth lines, we sort of see this repetition of the ing verb here. So musing, venturing, throwing, and seeking. So this repetition really conveys an energy, again, that mirrors that of the line in the top stanza. Same here, where we talk about tirelessly speeding them. We sort of see that again reflected here as we're talking about the soul itself, as it's musing and venturing and throwing. So it really conveys this sort of movement, this very kinetic sort of energy. And then as we sort of take a large scale look at it, we know that we've identified some imagery. We have a couple of pieces of figurative language that we can see working inside of the poem. This personification, this metaphor. Again, the personification of the spider is here as well. But inside of that, we've also began to identify our symbols. We know that our spider is symbolic of the soul in the second stanza. But moreover, down here, we have this web. Now, we don't call it a web, it's an implied idea. But the web here also is going to be a symbol for us, as that symbol is specifically referring to human connection, the way that people connect. This filament that the spider is launching forth are all of the ways that we as people try to connect with other people. So we'll make that note. And it's a symbol for human connection. And the ways we connect. That would lead to a discussion with students about ways that they connect with people, ways that they've seen people connect, and sort of what that tells us about ourselves and about people. And then as we're sort of looking at the poem as a whole, we know we've identified these symbols primarily in the top, and we can look at this bottom section and say, this is a little bit more of Whitman or our speaker talking to their soul. Our soul here is not symbolic in nature. So looking at that, we've identified some pieces of symbolism. We've identified several pieces of imagery, again, several pieces of figurative language. But if we sort of come back to this figurative language idea and we look at the poem as a whole, we can make the observation that the whole poem is metaphorical, right? So we're dealing with an extended metaphor here. That is sort of really pointing us toward this spider being compared to the human soul and its search for connection. So that's the big overarching piece of figurative language. So we'll make the note. With that, we sort of have a really good understanding of the poem overall. We sort of see the way that this imagery has contributed to this sort of longing, this sort of yearning feeling of the soul's desire to connect that we also see here with the spider, this desire for connection. And so we can start to think in terms of our tone and in terms of our theme. As we know, tone is informed by diction, right? So we're going to focus on the word choice in the poem. And so I would always have students like label the individual words that they think really contribute to like what they think the tone is. So we're going to make the note that here we're really sort of observing, like marked here, really sort of re-emphasizes that our speaker is watching the spider here and how to explore. And these are the things that it did, and these are kind of the things that we've seen. And so in that first stanza, we can sort of make the observation that, our tone is really observational. We're really paying attention to what it is the spider is doing. And the way that our speaker describes the spider as being noiseless and patient, and uses words like promontory and isolated. And I would have them label them as like WC or as a D for diction. So word choice here. And then again, we have this tirelessly speeding, this very movement driven language here. And as we come into that second stanza, we can notice that we've shifted a bit. Now we're not talking about the soul in a metaphorical sense, we're talking about it in a more literal sense. And so our language has shifted as well. And so he's talking about how the soul stands here. And these are the things that he notices, or our speaker notices about their soul, that they're surrounded and detached in this measureless ocean of space. And we sort of see this repetition of like the less sound here, measureless, ceaselessly. We could see that again in the upper stanza where we talk about tirelessly speeding them. So we have this sort of interesting word choice happening here, but we also described and sort of talked about this repetition, this energy, and it seems a bit more urgent. There's a level of urgency to this connection that we also see from the spider, but now it's not just launched forth filament, now it's ceaselessly musing, venturing and throwing and seeking. So now we're not just observing something, but we've taken a much more introspective tone. And so we would talk about what that means to be introspective, what it means to be very reflective. So it's introspective, but also we just talked about like this energy that's being communicated in that third line. And so it feels like there's a level of yearning that's happening as well, a desire for connection that's really being communicated in the language that we use here. Now, if we look at those last two lines in the second stanza, we notice that there's a repetition of the till here, and we have a change in the tense. So now we're in future tense. And so we're looking until. So we're looking into the forward, into the future, till the bridge you'll need be formed, till the ductile anchor hold, till the gossamer thread you fling catch somewhere. And I always love to point students towards this word, this gossamer thread idea, as that reemphasizes like the delicate nature of the spider's web, like this thin, beautiful gossamer thread that we sort of fling out into the hopes that it'll connect and that we'll be able to connect with it. And so that word choice really lends itself to this very yearning, introspective, and honestly hopeful tone that Whitman sort of crafts throughout the poem. Finally, we would finish with a conversation on theme. For this poem at this point, students have a really good understanding that what Whitman is really saying is in line with this idea of human connection, which is always really important. Our classes always start and we sort of base these ideas around the human condition and what it means to be human. And so this fits really well inside of that universal theme idea, that the theme is really people, our humanity's desire for connection, this desire to be connected and the ways that we connect with other people. And so students would make a note that that would be the theme, is like people's desire for connection. And not just connection, because like connection is easy, but really what we're looking for is like something that will hold, right? So people's desire for meaningful connection. And honestly, we would have a conversation about what that means. What are the differences between connections that you make casually that are very fleeting versus connections that are meaningful and that take hold or take root and sort of shape, our lives and our understanding of people. So people's desire for meaningful connection and all the ways we try to make those connections. I always think of it as things that we say, and then like humanity's desire for the creation of art and music and social media, I think, is a prime example of how we've designed a world around this need to make meaningful connection. And so we would have a conversation about the ways that our society has shaped that, things that we've done as humanity and as people to be able to make those connections and why that's so significant and how that really sort of speaks to humanity across the ages, in that it's not just now that we're desiring this level of connection. For as long as people have existed, we've desired connection. And so this would be, after close reading the poem, an opportunity for students to take some time and reflect on how we've seen connection and this desire for connection here pop up in other texts, and explore that intertextuality, while also making really good observations and connections to their own life in ways that they've sought connection, both meaningful and in a very sort of superfluous way. So that's how I would do a close reading, using the SIFT annotation strategy, and sort of work with students through the different lines of the poem and the different elements of the poem to see how, so they can see how all of the individual pieces come together to form the whole.